Hello, my friends. A strong and secure America, we're told, means a strong NATO. The rhetoric is always the same. Power equals legitimacy. Muscle equals morality. The speaker then pivots without any sense of irony into a claim that he's working every day to keep the U.S. military powerful while dealing with President Putin, who wants to make a deal, and dealing with President Zelensky, who wants to make a deal, and that he's meeting Zelensky. Today, the framing is pure theater. The United States cast as the indispensable mediator, the alliance as the grateful audience, and the war as a negotiation exercise that can be solved by force of personality. Then comes the petty spectacle name drops and mockery because modern Western politics can't resist the optics. The call to Emmanuel Macron becomes a moment of ridicule about those beautiful sunglasses, the sneer, "What the hell happened?" followed by grudging admiration for being tough. This is the West now. Geopolitics reduced to fashion, commentary, and ego management. From Nicosia, Cyprus, the discussion snaps to what is supposedly the day's big news story: Davos, the World Economic Forum, the annual gathering of elites who pretend they're steering history when, in reality, they're mostly reacting to it. Trump's plane was meant to depart for Davos yesterday. An electrical issue minor, we're told, forced it to turn back to Washington, D.C. for repairs. Then he took off later and arrived. Now the party begins. Trump in Switzerland, and the entire global political class watching like anxious spectators, waiting to hear what he'll say and, more importantly, what he'll demand. The most revealing piece isn't the plain story. It's the back-channel diplomacy being paraded as a breakthrough. We're told Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner met with Kirill Dmitriev in Davos, and everyone involved insists the meeting went well, really well, so well, in fact, that Witkoff and Kushner are supposedly going to Moscow tomorrow, allegedly at Vladimir Putin's invitation. Witkoff then adds the kind of boast you hear from people who haven't read the other side's terms. The Ukraine peace deal is 90% done. 90% done with whom? With Zelensky? With Europeans in Paris? With some summit agreements that Russia never signed, never accepted, and has no incentive to accept? You can inflate numbers all you want, 90%, 100%, 120%. But the key question remains, what does Russia say about any of it? Because Russia holds the leverage. That's not ideology. It's the battlefield and the infrastructure map. Look at the front lines, look at Ukraine's degrading energy grid, look at the internal oligarch wars, look at Europe's exhaustion, look at Washington's dwindling appetite and bandwidth. If you were going to Moscow in that context, if you were preparing to meet Putin, you would not be negotiating as if you're on equal footing. You would be preparing to capitulate to the minimum terms Russia is willing to formalize at that moment, because Moscow can simply keep tightening the screws until the other side breaks. And when Dmitriev says the more time passes, the more the U.S. envoys come around to Russia's way of thinking, he's revealing something important. Russia is not being persuaded by Western messaging. Western envoys are being forced to recalibrate to Russian realities. That's why the Green Goblin, the grotesque caricature of Zelensky as a man addicted to attention and applause, suddenly won't be going to Davos. That is described as shocking because the assumption in Western media is that Zelensky must be at every global gathering, collecting pledges, staging photo ops, absorbing oxygen. But the upside-down world is real, the biggest gathering of money and leaders on Earth, and Zelensky is absent. Why? Because the spotlight has moved. According to Politico, Greenland turmoil is eclipsing Ukraine at Davos. Europe's leaders, assembled at the World Economic Forum, are consumed not by Ukraine, but by Donald Trump's push to annex an Arctic island. Ukraine, once the sacred cause, has been displaced by Greenland. That isn't just poetic, it's instructive. It shows how disposable narratives are in the West. One minute, Ukraine is civilization itself. The next minute, it's crowded out by a territorial dispute involving a NATO ally and the United States. And this, too, feeds the Zelensky absence story. Why go if you won't be the center of attention? There's also the claim that Zelensky was supposed to go to Davos to sign some massive financing arrangement, an $800 billion, 10-year deal, and perhaps U.S.-Ukraine security guarantees. But there's no serious reason to believe any of that was real. It's more plausible as a public relations prop, a rumor deployed so that when it doesn't happen, someone else can be blamed. And it's convenient, isn't it, that Trump can avoid the awkwardness entirely? Avoid meeting Zelensky. Avoid explaining why he doesn't want to sign $800 billion in new commitments. Avoid signing security guarantees. Conveniently pivot to Greenland and force Europe to chase him there. If the aim is to dominate the agenda and keep everyone off balance, it's perfect. So what's Davos actually delivering so far? A lineup of speeches. Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, and Mark Carney, now described as the Prime Minister of Canada, a reminder that the speaker's transcript world is its own universe of roles and titles. Macron becomes a spectacle because of sunglasses. The shallow obsession with image replaces substance. But Carney's remarks, whether you like him or not, land like a confession from inside the system. Carney essentially tells the elite class, the international rules-based order is over, and we shouldn't mourn it. Then he goes further, he says there never really was one. That's the crack in the facade. For years, the West has demanded obedience from the rest of the world under the banner of rules, while refusing to publish the rulebook. People searched for it like a mythical PDF, the rules-based order handbook. It never appeared because it never existed as a consistent universal framework. It was a slogan used to dress up power politics as morality. Carney's admission, whether accidental or calculated, exposes the scam. The rules were improvisations that served Western interests. When they stopped serving Western interests, the West stopped pretending they were rules. Now the elite class is turning on itself, and suddenly the whole performance is less fun. Then NATO's top leadership steps in, and what follows is not strategy but supplication. Mark Rutte is described as doing major flattery toward Trump, misunderstood Trump, don't be so hard on him, and then the predictable pivot, Russia and China in the Arctic. Trump is right, we must protect the Arctic. 8 Arctic countries are NATO members. Only Russia is outside NATO, so NATO must defend the region. Notice the inversion. The immediate threat to European territory is the United States openly discussing annexation of Greenland, yet NATO officials talk as if Russia is the urgent menace and Trump is merely practicing tough love. That's not analysis. That's fear or complicity. And here's the deeper rot. Not one Western leader plainly says what is happening in front of everyone's face. The United States is trying to take European territory from Denmark. They won't say it directly. They wrap everything in euphemisms. Allies, partnership, Arctic security, unity, Russia, China. They criticize tariffs and tone. They never confront the core reality because they're terrified of the patron or they're all playing agreed-upon roles in a coordinated drama. That possibility, this could all be theater, pre-decided, coordinated, is not crazy. Trump's foreign policy brand is misdirection, deception, distraction, trickery. If the aim is to scramble Europe, force concessions, and extract tribute while claiming he is saving NATO, then the performance works. We also see the UK's posture. Reports suggest Britain may allow US bases to be used for a potential strike on Iran. And Keir Starmer, like Macron, has been careful not to be too aggressive in criticizing Trump over Greenland. The implication is clear. London is trying to stay close to Washington for the Iran file, and therefore cannot risk a frontal clash over Greenland. Finland's leader, Alexander Stubb, appears and does the standard performance. Everything is about Russia. Finland can defend itself. Finland can fight. America will be there if Russia attacks. But again, the question is backwards. If the United States is positioning to seize Greenland European territory, then the real test is not whether Europe can defend itself from Russia, but whether Europe can defend itself from America's demands and coercion. Yet the Western script cannot handle that thought. And the Ukraine narrative collapses even further when Stubb asserts that NATO hasn't entered the scene yet in Ukraine. This is absurd. NATO has run the proxy war money, weapons, intelligence, training, logistics, political cover. Ukraine has functioned as a de facto NATO army, and despite that, it is being ground down. The claim that NATO isn't involved is the kind of denial required to keep the propaganda intact. Macron then warns that this is not the time for new imperialism or new colonialism. The hypocrisy is almost comical. Only now, when the imperial impulse is pointed inward at Europe, do they suddenly discover anti-colonial rhetoric. When Western power was being projected outward, the language was values, democracy, and rules. Now that the bite is aimed at their own flank, they rediscover moral vocabulary. Ursula von der Leyen, stunning and brave, in the transcript's mocking tone declares that no country has the right to take another country's territory. Not in Ukraine, not in Greenland, not anywhere. Then the obvious rebuttal detonates. Cyprus, Kosovo, Syria, how many examples do you want? Western leaders lecture the world on sovereignty while normalizing partition and seizure when it suits them. Denmark itself recognized Kosovo early and now wants to preach principle as if history began yesterday. Meanwhile, the Ukraine situation continues to deteriorate in plain physical terms. Reports describe Kyiv facing catastrophe. No power, minus 18 degrees Celsius, ongoing Russian attacks. Mayor Vitaly Klitschko is cited claiming hundreds of thousands are evacuating or have left the city, enormous numbers. Heat, electricity, water, failing. Blackouts in Kyiv, Kharkiv, and beyond. And this is where Russia's leverage becomes undeniable. When Witkoff and Kushner walk into a room with Putin, Russia can lay down a blunt reality. Accept our terms, because we can shut down Ukraine's lights whenever we choose. One more coordinated strike, and the grid collapses into a humanitarian catastrophe. That catastrophe doesn't just hit Ukraine, it spills into Europe via refugees. Europe already cannot handle the political consequences of its own decisions. It certainly cannot handle a fresh wave driven by winter blackouts. So, when Russia sets conditions, root causes, June 2024 baselines, minimums, those are not bargaining chips. They are the floor of what Moscow is willing to formalize, and the West has no credible method to raise the ceiling. Tomorrow's meeting in Moscow is described as the first between Putin and U.S. envoys since a Novgorod drone strike, with the Davos meeting being the first U.S. Russia contact since then as well. And layered into this is the economic angle. Bloomberg is referenced on Russia benefiting from a surge in gold prices since the start of the war, rebuilding reserves, replacing lost assets. Dmitriev posts triumphantly that Russian reserves have increased by at least $216 billion over 4 years due to rising gold prices. The point is not the exact number, it's the boomerang effect. The West froze Russian assets, but in doing so it degraded trust in Western financial infrastructure and pushed capital towards safe havens like gold benefiting Russia. The frozen assets, often described as around $140 billion at Euroclear, look smaller beside the gains from gold's rise. Even worse for Europe, the long-term damage is structural. The perception that Western systems are politically weaponized accelerates de-dollarization and pushes countries to diversify away from Western custody. Europe congratulated itself for punishing Russia. In reality, it undermined itself. And over time, it's entirely plausible Russia eventually recovers what is frozen as well through legal pressure, retaliatory measures, political deals, or the slow erosion of the West's ability to enforce its seizures. That would turn the entire sanction strategy into a comprehensive loss, economic self-harm for Europe, strategic adjustment by Russia, and a global lesson learned by everyone watching. Then comes another Davos vignette, Christine Lagarde, head of the European Central Bank, confronted by a journalist about claims of limiting EU citizens' spending to €1,000, particularly regarding cash or digital euro transactions. Lagarde refuses to answer directly, offering evasions. You can't shut off cash, but digital rails can be controlled. Whether the €1,000 figure is precise or not, the broader pattern is obvious. European technocrats are obsessed with programmable money, surveillance finance, and behavioral control. And they want it framed as modernization, while citizens experience it as a tightening noose. The Peace Board is then floated by Witkoff as game-changing, a board of peace, an invitation-based structure meant to corral Russia and Ukraine into a managed outcome. But even within this narrative, countries are hesitant. France is said to refuse, Norway may reject, the UK may hold out at least at first. Then comes the prediction that eventually they'll all accept, because what we're seeing is theatrics, a show of independence before compliance. That's the rhythm of Western politics now. Perform dissent, then submit. Putin's special envoy praises constructive talks with the U.S. That's the headline-style summary that gets circulated, and it matters less for what it says than for what it signals. The channel is open again, and Moscow is comfortable enough to let that be seen. Dmitriev tells reporters the meeting was constructive after leaving the U.S. venue at the forum, reportedly USA House, and adds the kind of line that is both vague and pointed. More and more people recognize the validity of Russia's position. No elaboration needed, because the validation is written across reality itself. The battlefield, the economic blowback, the crumbling unity inside Europe, and the quiet retcher. Witkoff, for his part, describes the talks as very positive but provides no details. That also tracks. When Western envoys speak in adjectives instead of specifics, it usually means they are still trying to sell the optics at home while preparing to accept terms they previously swore were impossible. This is how breakthroughs are marketed. You drown the public in positivity while keeping the actual concessions off camera. Then Trump is asked before leaving for Davos how far he's willing to go to acquire Greenland. His answer is as blunt as it is revealing. You'll find out. That line tells you everything about the posture. There's no diplomatic ambiguity there. It's not a negotiation framed as mutual benefit. It's a threat framed as suspense. The point is to keep everyone guessing, to force allies to react, to maximize leverage by weaponizing uncertainty. At the same time, another pressure story circulates. The Washington Post publishes a piece about the United States pulling out of around 30 NATO mechanisms. The Europeans panic because any U.S. pullback, real or symbolic, hits their deepest fear, that the American security umbrella is conditional, transactional, and potentially revocable. But if you read such reports with a cold eye, many of these mechanisms are often administrative training programs, coordination structures, committee functions, In other words, things the Europeans could handle themselves if they weren't addicted to the U.S. acting as manager, financier, and enforcer. Still, panic is the product. Panic is the goal. Panic produces compliance. And Trump feeds that atmosphere with a self-mythologizing post. No single person or president has done more for NATO than President Donald J. Trump. If I didn't come along, there would be no NATO right now. It would have been in the ash heap of history. The claim is obviously inflated, but the psychology behind it is consistent. He wants NATO to feel like a franchise he saved, therefore a franchise that owes him. That's how you transform an alliance into a protection racket without ever using the word. Then Donald Tusk posts on X. Appeasement is a sign of weakness. Europe cannot afford to be weak, neither against its enemies nor its ally. Appeasement brings humiliation. European assertiveness is the need of the moment. Notice the cowardice embedded in the phrasing. Enemy is named implicitly Russia, China, Iran, the multipolar world, anyone who refuses Western command. But the ally is not named, because naming the ally would mean confronting the obvious. The ally is the United States under Trump, applying pressure tactics against Europe itself. So Tusk speaks in code. Everyone speaks in code. They say ally because they're afraid to say America. They're terrified of the patron, but they're also terrified of admitting to their own populations that the patron can turn predator at any moment. And that's where the Davos spectacle slides from geopolitics into what can only be described as the decadence of the ruling class. The Clown World segment mockery dressed as commentary takes us to Davos, where celebrity and politics merge into one indistinguishable soup. There's Justin Trudeau, described as the former Prime Minister of Canada, and there's Katy Perry portrayed as his astronaut girlfriend showing up as a power couple. The details are sensationalized, but the larger point is that Davos is not a serious governance forum. It's a stage, a networking carnival, a branding event for the elite. The question, why is Trudeau at Davos, answers itself in the worldview being laid out. Because he is the prototype, the mold, the template for the kind of polished, media-trained, ideology-compatible leader the Davos class likes to produce and replicate. Start with one model, then roll out the clones. Macron, Rutte, and the rest, each tailored to their national audience, but aligned to the same managerial worldview. That's the argument. Davos isn't just a conference. It's a factory for political class reproduction. Then, the narrative snaps back to Europe's internal eruption over Greenland. In the European Parliament, amid the speeches and moral posturing, a Danish MEP Anders Vistisen is described delivering a message to Trump in blunt language. F off. That outburst matters because it breaks the spell for a moment. It says the quiet part out loud. Denmark sees a direct threat to its territory, and some Europeans are done with the euphemisms. But even that anger is trapped inside the broader Western pattern. Loud statements for the cameras, careful behavior behind the scenes. And then we return to the core strategic truth that keeps resurfacing like a steel spike through the fog of theatrics. Russia has leverage, and Russia has patience. If Witkoff and Kushner go to Moscow, it will not be because Putin needs them. It will be because Washington needs a way out that doesn't look like surrender, and because Europe needs a way to stop the bleeding without admitting the project failed. The West spent years inflating Ukraine as an unstoppable fortress, saturating it with weapons, intelligence, money, and political backing, all while insisting Russia was collapsing economically, militarily, diplomatically. And now, in the middle of winter, the story on the ground is the opposite. Cities facing blackouts and deep cold, evacuation numbers floating into the hundreds of thousands, infrastructure on the edge, European funding fatigue, U.S., political bandwidth collapsing under its own contradictions. When the grid fails and the cold bites, propaganda doesn't keep families warm. That is why Moscow can afford to be calm. And that is why the deal is 90% done line sounds like something meant for Western audiences rather than a description of the negotiating table. You don't announce a deal is nearly finished before you've secured the key parties' agreement unless you're trying to create momentum, pressure, and an illusion of inevitability. It's a classic tactic. You tell the public the train is already moving so that anyone who objects looks like an obstructionist. But Russia isn't playing that game. Russia's terms are not shaped by Davos applause. They're shaped by the operational map and the strategic objective. End the war on terms that remove the root causes, not pause it so the West can reload the proxy. That's why you keep hearing that phrase root causes, and why it's described as the minimum. Because from Moscow's perspective, a ceasefire that leaves NATO's infrastructure and political intent intact is not peace. It's an intermission. And Russia has no rational reason to accept an intermission when the trend lines are moving in its favor. What about the Western Board of Peace, the supposed new framework that is game-changing? It's exactly what it sounds like. an attempt to reframe a hard military and strategic defeat into a managed, committee-driven process where Western capitals retain influence through procedure. A board lets the West pretend it is still arbitrating history. It also lets them distribute responsibility so no single leader has to own the humiliation. But even inside that fantasy, you see the fractures. France hesitating, Norway hesitating, the UK hesitating, until the prediction goes, they fall into line. That is how the West operates when faced with irreversible shifts. First outrage, then bargaining, then compliance, each stage performed publicly, each concession finalized privately. And running parallel to this is the financial control theme symbolized by Lagarde, the push toward digital money, programmable constraints, soft coercion dressed as modernization. The public hears efficiency, the elite hears control. The gap between those meanings is where trust dies. At this point, the entire Davos tableau becomes a portrait of a system that can no longer maintain its own myths. Carney says the rules-based order never existed. NATO officials beg Trump while insisting Russia is the threat. European leaders speak about imperialism as if they didn't spend decades exporting it. They condemn territorial conquest while selectively endorsing it when it suited them. They talk about alliance unity while being openly pressured, threatened, and tariffed by the alliance leader. And they try to keep Ukraine centered in the narrative while Greenland, a territorial dispute involving the United States and a European country, steals the spotlight. If you want the simplest way to understand it, it's this. The West is discovering that power politics apply to it too. For decades, Western elites acted as if sovereignty was conditional for everyone except themselves, as if rules were binding for others and optional for them, as if coercion only flowed outward, never inward. Now the coercion is turning inside the club. Suddenly, the European leadership has to confront what the rest of the world has always known. Alliances are not families, they are instruments. And instruments can be used against friends as easily as enemies when the user sees advantage. That is why the Greenland drama matters more than the media wants to admit. It is not simply a territorial argument. It is a test of whether Europe is a serious political entity or a managed dependency. If Europe cannot even speak plainly when a U.S. president threatens to seize a chunk of its territory, then Europe is not sovereign in any meaningful sense. And the Ukraine war sits in the background like a slow, grinding verdict. Because the entire project turning Ukraine into an anti-Russia battering ram was meant to demonstrate Western dominance. It was meant to show that sanctions could cripple Russia, that NATO could dictate the terms of European security, that Washington could weaken Moscow without paying a price. Instead, the West has stumbled into a landscape where Russia adapts, the global South recalculates, gold rises, alternative payment paths strengthen, and Europe bleeds itself economically and politically. Meanwhile, the propaganda machine is reduced to spectacle. Sunglasses, celebrities, slapstick, and panels where everyone blames Russia for everything while tiptoeing around the fact that the United States is the immediate destabilizer inside NATO. So the question isn't really whether there will be a meeting in Moscow, or whether Trump delivers a big speech later that afternoon, or whether Zelensky shows up at Davos at the last moment to chase cameras. The question is whether the West can accept that it no longer sets the terms. Because Russia is acting like a power that believes time is on its side. And the West is acting like a bloc that has to fill every silence with hype, every setback with a committee, every contradiction with a performance. That's not strength. That's a system trying to talk itself out of a reality it can't reverse. And if Trump's answer on Greenland, you'll find out, is the message to Europe, then Europe's real problem isn't Russia at its eastern edge. Europe's real problem is that it still can't admit, out loud, who is squeezing it, because doing so would force it to face what it has become.